Was constantly looking for a fight, was angry, just felt overwhelmed by everything.
For a long time, I just thought I was crazy and probably belonged locked up somewhere, at least for those 2 weeks.
It wasn't until we read about this in the magazine that my husband turned around and said, "This is what is the matter with you. You have PMS."
Good evening. The women you saw a moment ago are being treated for a condition known as PMS, or premenstrual syndrome. It's something doctors used to dismiss lightly, but are starting to take it seriously as a medical condition that causes many women and their families a lot of misery. The symptoms can range from mild discomfort to suicidal depression. In this country, 26 million women are thought to suffer from it in some degree, but there's no agreement on what causes it and considerable argument over how to treat it. The controversy isn't confined to the medical field. PMS became the focus of a legal debate when it was offered as a defense in court. And feminists are worried that recognition of PMS will backfire on women by reviving old myths that females are prisoners of their hormones and should not be trusted with sensitive or responsible positions. Tonight, PMS and its implications for women, in and out of the courtroom. Jim?
Robin, first there were 2 criminal cases in Britain last year involving PMS. A barmaid in East London was arrested for threatening a police officer with a knife. She had an extensive criminal record which included a murder conviction. Her attorney successfully argued that she suffered from premenstrual syndrome, which transformed her every month into a raging animal. She was given probation. The second case was that of a young woman who had killed her lover by running over him with a car. She also claimed to be suffering at the time from an extremely aggravated form of PMS. The charge was reduced to manslaughter, and she was conditionally released. Then, earlier this year, it was raised as a legal defense for the first time in the United States. It was in a Brooklyn, New York court in the case of a 25-year-old woman accused of beating her 4-year-old daughter. But the PMS issue never went to a jury because the woman pleaded guilty to a lesser charge. An action, as we'll see in a few minutes, that is seen very differently by the lawyers on both sides. But before we get to that legal argument, a look at what PMS is, first as described by women who suffer from it. Our reporter, Maura Lerner, talked to 3 of them at a Massachusetts clinic where they are undergoing treatment.
There are bad days and there are bad days. PMS is not just a bad day. It's a very different feeling. I think all of us still now have days where, you know, things are tough or we have to face situations that are difficult. We can sit down and face them. The other way, it was just like, everything was so overwhelming. The slightest little thing that, at least for myself, things that I would normally do, routine things, I just couldn't handle.
I feel I've had it for probably about 18 years. When I was about 21 or 22, in working, I would notice that there were times when I would get really hyper, I guess is the best way I can put it, because my moods, I would get very depressed, almost to the point of inactivity, unable to function at all. That making supper was just such an effort, I didn't want to bother with it for anyone.
Can you give me some examples of how you acted during a bout with PMS?
I cracked a wall with my fist. I was coming into the house and my father had met me and just asked, you know, why I was late. And I just went into a rage and started beating on the walls. He pulled me away from the wall and I continued to beat on his chest until they could hold me enough to stop it. That's not my normal behavior. You know, I'm not usually one to be that aggressive. You know, I just couldn't handle it.
One time I can remember I took a glass and I smashed it. But I just crushed it with my hands. I just took it and smashed it right in my hands and right all over my hands because I wanted to hit my child. And I just grabbed the glass and I just screamed and I, just put all this pressure on this glass and smashed it out and threw it down. And, just screamed at them to get out, get away. leave me alone, you know, and just ran up to my room, closed the door, knew I couldn't go out of there because I was in a dangerous, I felt like I would really hurt them.
For a long time, I just thought I was crazy and probably belonged locked up somewhere, at least for those 2 weeks. And then I started to think about it. And after I had read some articles on PMS, I said, wait a minute. This is very cyclical. It's happening to me once a month at the same time every single month that I start to feel this way. Something else has got to be going on.
I was getting to the point each month where I was just feeling, I just can't go on like this. I just can't continue like this. It was so awful and so overwhelming that everything would be better. And I can remember, you know, just sitting and crying. And I couldn't relate, I couldn't say it was this or that or any other thing that had made me, you know, cry. I just cried and cried and cried. And I really thought I was going crazy. And I just, like, this has got to end. If it doesn't end, then maybe I've got to end. You know, that was just the whole overwhelming feeling, because I just couldn't live like that.
The man who founded the clinic in which those women were being treated is Dr. Ronald Norris, who leads the effort in this country to increase awareness and understanding of PMS. Dr. Norris is a psychiatrist and a specialist in reproductive endocrinology. He's in Houston for a 2-day conference on PMS. Dr. Norris, how typical of PMS sufferers are those 3 women?
These women are very representative of women who suffer from severe premenstrual syndrome.
Yeah. How many women suffer from it to the degree that it disrupts their lives? Do you have any estimate of how many there may be?
Well, it's been estimated that between 5 and 10% of women in the reproductive years suffer from it to the degree as shown by these women.
And how many women does that add up to?
That'd be approximately 10 million.
Do you know what causes it?
No, we don't know what causes it. There are a number of theories, and the one that is most likely to explain all the things that are seen with the premenstrual syndrome and the particular timing that it has in the woman's menstrual cycle is a theory that sees the disorder as lying in the hypothalamic pituitary axis.
Which does what?
Well, that tends to control the hormonal output from the various endocrine glands in the body, and also has to do with things such as emotions, sleep-wake cycle, fluid control in the body, those sorts of things.
How do you treat it?
Well, we recommend for women who have severe PMS that they first try a number of nutritional changes, lifestyle changes in terms of removing stress from their life, cutting down on caffeine. If they retain fluid, diminish the amount of salt that they take in, regular exercise, those sorts of things. But usually with women with severe PMS, those things will be helpful, but not sufficient. And with those women, we usually recommend progesterone.
Progesterone, which is one of the hormones you were talking about produced by these glands.
Yes, it's a natural hormone.
And normally produced in some larger quantity during a certain time in the menstrual cycle, is that correct?
During the second half of the cycle, and then again, when a woman's pregnant, she's exposed to large amounts of progesterone in her body.
Does it work, your treatment?
Yes, it does.
Progesterone treatment?
Yes, and you shouldn't say our treatment. There are a number of people who use progesterone and have used progesterone for years.
The FDA, as I understand it, has not approved the progesterone in the quantities or the manner in which you use it, and also some members of the FDA express anxiety about the possible long-term consequences of using it, the hormone, in those quantities. What is your comment on that, their anxiety?
Well, I think the anxiety is reasonable. I don't think it's reasonable in its extent, but the fact that there is a concern about it, I think is reasonable. I think we have to keep in mind several things. One is women have been exposed to progesterone for centuries. It is a natural hormone in their body, so it's nothing new for the woman. Dr. Dalton and other physicians in England have used progesterone in the treatment of the premenstrual syndrome since at least 1953. For instance, last year in England alone, there were 1.5 million suppositories sold progesterone suppositories sold for PMS. So it's nothing new. The FDA has not approved it, but then the reason for that is not because they've disapproved it, it's because none of the appropriate scientific studies have been yet filed with the FDA so that they could approve it on the basis of safety and efficacy.
I see.
From a clinical standpoint, though, we do know that it works, and I might point out to you that Dr. Dalton, for instance, in England, has followed 40 women who have been on progesterone for well over 10 years and has found no adverse effects. The other thing that I might point out is that there is a study that suggests that if you have a progesterone deficiency, you definitely are at risk for increased premenopausal breast cancer. So just as we can ask the question, are there risks, there also may be benefits. And the only way we're going to find that out is by following women who have been on progesterone for a long period of time, and that's going to be a study that we will know about 10 or 15 years from now. It is not a study that can be answered now, but there is no evidence at this point that would cause one to be alarmed. We need to have that concern and follow these women, but we don't need to be alarmed.
Well, thank you. Jim?
Now to the legal argument in the Brooklyn case involving a woman charged with child beating. Her attorney was Stephanie Benson, a legal aid attorney in New York City. Ms. Benson, does the fact that your client pleaded guilty to a lesser charge means the PMS defense was dropped as ineffective?
No. In fact, my client was originally accused of a violent felony. A felony is one of the two categories of criminal cases. Misdemeanors are the less serious. The fact is that all criminal charges were eventually dismissed against my client. She walked out with a violation, which is not a criminal conviction. It's equivalent to a parking ticket. She got no jail time, no fine, no probation, and in a year her court papers will be sealed. So in essence, it was just an offer that the defense couldn't refuse.
Do you believe that you got that offer that you couldn't refuse because you had raised the PMS defense?
Well, I can't read the mind of the district attorney. I believe that the case, starting as a violent felony, would not have been dismissed, all the criminal charges, had there not been some problems in the district attorney's case.
Had you any indication, or at least any feeling, that if it had gone on to trial, that the PMS defense would have prevailed and that your client would have walked out of there completely innocent?
Well, I can tell you that in a pretrial hearing in April, a judge ruled that it was an admissible defense. And so that initial hurdle has been cleared already. I do believe that the district attorney's office would not have been able to prove that a criminal act and a criminal intent were present beyond a reasonable doubt. They have the burden of proof. The defense does not have the burden of proving anything. It may be that premenstrual stress syndrome is not a medical certainty, but it may be enough to prove a reasonable doubt.
What caused you to raise it in your client's behalf in the first place?
I work for legal aid, and I was assigned to arraignments, which is the first court appearance. Ms. Santos, who was very much in disarray and upset, told me three things over and over.
That's your client, Ms. Santos,
That's right, Shirley
okay.
Santos.
All right.
She said, in this order, I got my period, I don't know what happened, but I didn't mean to hurt my child. By the fact that she said I didn't mean to hurt my child was a statement that she lacked criminal intent. The fact that she didn't remember was a statement that it may have been unconscious, and unconsciousness and automatism are accepted defenses in this country. The piece that didn't fit was that she had gotten her period. So I sent her to be evaluated, and a psychiatrist diagnosed her to his certainty as having premenstrual stress syndrome, and I felt that it was incumbent upon me to protect my client's constitutional rights to a fair trial and effective assistance of counsel, that any argument should be raised in her behalf.
Had you done any research or reading or anything on PMS as a legal defense, maybe as it related to the British cases beforehand, or was this something that just came to you out of the blue?
It came to me out of the blue, and I was sort of plunged into a whole time of frantic medical research. As a legal aid attorney, I have 70 other cases, and this case certainly had its unusual aspects. It wasn't until several weeks after the case that I heard about premenstrual stress syndrome.
Any question in your mind that it is a legitimate legal defense?
There's absolutely no question in my mind that it is a legitimate legal defense.
Are you concerned at all about those who suggest that it could be abused, where many, many women may now start coming into court and using PMS as an excuse for all kinds of criminal activity?
Well, I think that you always have to prove certain things, and if a person was suffering from premenstrual stress syndrome, if she could show that, if she could show that it was severe enough to have interfered with her ability to act in a free way, a voluntary way, or to form the necessary intent, then I think she should be able to present that proof. I think not to be able to present that proof would be a denial of her constitutional rights to a fair trial.
What do you say, finally, to those who complain, particularly some in the feminist movement, who complain that what you have done could lead to discrimination against women?
Well, initially I would like to say that as a criminal defense attorney, it is my obligation to raise the best defense for my client. It is not my obligation to worry about somebody else's pay increases. But as a feminist, I am concerned. However, I think it presupposes that women are not the ones in positions of power. In this case, my supervisor, myself, my client, the district attorney, and the 2 assistant district attorneys were all women. So women are in positions of power, and I don't think they're as readily able to discriminate. And the fact is, women have had menstrual periods for long before we even had an alphabet. And the fact that we have 3 initials to describe a set of symptoms now doesn't mean that men are going to be able to use it any more effectively. The question is, are we going to avoid the issue? Are we going to deny this? Or are we going to say PMS is out of the closet? We want a proper diagnosis and treatment.
Thank you. Robin?
The other side of the case sees the PMS defense very differently. Barbara Newman is a prosecutor with the Brooklyn DA's office, which pressed the case against Ms. Benson's client. Ms. Newman, you do not think that PMS is a legitimate defense.
That's true. But
why not?
I will tell you that in a moment, but I must proceed my remarks by correcting 2 misstatements that Ms. Benson made. No charges were dismissed against her client. She pled to a reduced charge, a violation. No charge was dismissed because of premenstrual syndrome. That's one misstatement. The second misstatement is that no judge has ruled that premenstrual syndrome is an admissible defense or evidence of premenstrual syndrome is admissible in court. In the proceeding that Ms. Benson referred to on April 29th in Brooklyn, on this case, Ms. Benson raised a series of reasons why the case should be dismissed. The judge denied the motion. There's been no judicial determination that evidence of premenstrual syndrome, or so-called premenstrual syndrome, is admissible. But to your question.
Well, I think you've answered it. You do not think it is a legitimate defense.
There is no scientific evidence that as a result of any phase of the menstrual cycle, women should be relieved of criminal responsibility. It's a medical issue. It is not a legal issue.
Do you agree with what Ms. Benson said, at least in a letter to the New York Times, that it was the strength of that defense that persuaded your office to plea bargain with her client?
Absolutely not. Let me just give you a little chronology of the case.
If you could briefly.
Okay. The incident occurred on December 16th, 1981. About a month after the incident, the case was reduced from a felony to a misdemeanor after we had evaluated all the facts and circumstances of the case. This was about a month before the words premenstrual syndrome were ever uttered with respect to the case. So that decision was made a month before the mention of this so-called defense. Thereafter, we treated this case in the ordinary, usual manner. The disposition that was arrived at neither punished Ms. Santos, the defendant, nor rewarded her for having raised the defense. She has, the disposition requires her, and as a condition of the disposition, she is in therapy now. She's getting educational therapy and psychotherapy. She must cooperate with the Bureau of Child Welfare. She must enter child abuse.
If I may,
yes,
I don't mean to interrupt,
okay.
but I just want to come on to some other points. I think you're saying that the PMS issue did not change
Absolutely
your behavior.
Not at all.
You've heard, first of all, several women describe their symptoms with premenstrual stress, and you've heard Ms. Benson raise it. How do you know that premenstrual stress does not cause such conditions in a woman that it might affect her behavior so as to affect it, as Ms. Benson puts it, beyond a reasonable doubt?
Okay. We studied 3,000 medical periodicals on the subject and found absolutely no scientific evidence in the literature that as a result of premenstrual syndrome, so-called premenstrual syndrome, women lose control to the extent that they should be relieved from criminal responsibility. Even one of the women on the excerpt earlier said, I felt like hitting my children, so I locked myself in my room. She maintained control.
All right. What would be the consequences if PMS were admitted as a legitimate defense in court, in your view?
It's much more significantly a sword to be used against women than a shield for them. No woman could ever be trusted with any position of responsibility, including having children, having the care and custody of children. This could justify assaults upon women. The man could say, this woman was out of control. I had to kill her, and there's the woman dead on the floor, not in a position to refute it. It could be used in custody battles by a husband who is attempting to get the children away from the child. And naturally, no position such as a professional position could be held by a woman also.
Well, thank you. Jim?
Ms. Benson, what do you say to that?
Well, I'd like to address the two initial remarks as to my, quote, misstatements. In the first case, when asked by the New York Daily News to explain further his ruling, Judge Jerome Becker in the April 29th case said, quote, I ruled it was an admissible defense. And in fact, he allowed in all the arguments that the defense had. As to the second thing, perhaps dismissal is not the technical term, but in fact, the felony and misdemeanor charges were never carried, and my client was never convicted of a crime. I would like to say that as far as it being used as a sword against women, that men nowadays have a shorter longevity and are more likely to suffer from cardiovascular and digestive problems, and those aren't used against men. And you can't say, for example, that sickle cell anemia doesn't exist because it could be used against men. Rather, you have to press for the proper treatment of these things. PMS will not be stuffed back in the closet, and if in fact it interferes with someone's ability to act in a free manner, then we term that act not a criminal act. For example, if my hand was blown into yours with an umbrella, that's not a product of free will. That's not actus reus, which is one of the requirements, a criminal act. And if in fact the woman was so confused or had hazy thinking that she did not formulate the intent, then that other element which the district attorney must prove, that of criminal intent, is missing. And those are two things that must be proven in a case. The burden is on not the defense, but the district attorney to disprove those elements.
And you say, Ms. Newman, that, and based on your reading of it, that PMS would never qualify as a legal defense because it just doesn't gel, right?
The literature, the present state of scientific research in the area of premenstrual syndrome gives rise to there's no evidence at the present moment that as a result of any phase of the menstrual cycle, women should be relieved in any aspect of the law from responsibility.
Let's ask Dr. Norris about this. Doctor, how do you feel about the use of PMS as a legal defense in a criminal matter?
I think there will be rare cases where it might apply as a defense, but I think they'll be very rare. I think the more appropriate place to consider PMS in a criminal proceeding is at the time of sentencing. And if
as a mitigating circumstance rather than as a defense for absolving responsibility.
That's right. And if you look at what happened in the British courts, that's essentially what they did. They convicted both of these women based on the evidence, and then considered PMS in regard to sentencing, and considered it in the light of a diminished responsibility. And I think that that's the appropriate place for PMS as well as any other medical disorder.
Well, what is the state of the, quote, scientific evidence in terms of what PMS can do in terms of causing somebody to commit a violent act against their, be out of control and commit a criminal violent act?
Well, it's one thing to raise an issue of it causing a violent act as opposed to a violent act occurring during the period of time that a woman is experiencing severe symptoms. And that really is a question for the courts. That's not a question for the physicians.
All right, then well, phrase the question any way you want to give me what the scientific evidence is on the connection between PMS and violent acts.
Well, it's not very good in terms of PMS and violent acts per se. We do know that women do experience more accidents, have more hospital admissions, a variety of things like that which occur during the perimenstruum, or the last 4 days of the cycle and the first 4 days of menstruation. So statistically, there's a greater incidence of these things that do occur in women. But the studies that show there's a close link between violent behavior of a woman and PMS, there's no evidence for that.
Ms. Benson?
Well, I would like to say that there are two studies. The first study was done in 1952 in New York City by a man named Morton, and he found that 62% of the women arrested for violent crimes were in their perimenstruum. And in fact, in 1961, another study showed that 49% of all emergency hospital admissions, suicides, and arrests were in the woman's perimenstruum. Now, we may not have what we want, which is the hardcore medical evidence, but still, there are studies that support this. In fact, in the literature of PMS, repeatedly, one sees reference to child battering and violence. There's a connection between premenstrual stress syndrome and hypoglycemia, which has been used as a defense. And hypoglycemia can cause aggression also.
Dr. Norris, do you read those, the results of those studies the same way Ms. Benson does?
Well, I might read the study the same way. I have a different interpretation of what they mean.
How would you interpret it?
Well, those are statistical studies that show, yes, for a greater proportion of women, these things do occur, but it's a far cry from saying this for a general population of women as opposed to applying it to one individual case.
Yeah. Ms. Newman, back to the other point that you raised and then Ms. Benson answered, this question of it being used as a sword against women. You heard what Ms. Benson said, that there's sickle cell anemia in terms of blacks, there's cardiovascular disease in terms of men. People don't discriminate against them basically because of that. Why do you think they would against women in a case of PMS?
Well, the nature of the disability that adherents of so-called PMS describe is insanity. Quite contrary from a physical impairment. Many people can do excellent jobs with physical impairments, people in wheelchairs, people who are blind, people who are hearing impaired, but we are talking with a qualitative difference. You're talking about people who are out of control, who you're not going to trust to cut the bagels on the job once a month because she's going to maybe pick up the knife and stab you. So it's an entirely different type of a disability that we're describing.
Thank you. Robin?
Yes, Dr. Norris, thank you for joining us in Houston. Ms. Benson, Ms. Newman, thank you for joining us in New York. Good night, Jim.
Good night, Robin.
That's all for tonight. We'll be back tomorrow night. I'm Robert McNeil. Good night.
Reflect on the past year and glimpse the year ahead when Governor Jim Hunt joins William Friday for a half hour of dialogue on North Carolina People, Monday at 7:30 on Public TV.
For a transcript, send $2 to the McNeil Lehrer Report, Box 345, New York, New York, 10101. The McNeil Lehrer Report was produced by WNET and WETA. They are solely responsible for its content.
For centuries in many human societies, a woman's menstrual cycle has been a source of taboo and prejudice. Now, thanks mainly to medical science, most of those clouds of misunderstanding have been lifted. But recently, medical science has started to examine a new phenomenon, a malady which it's said causes distressing symptoms in a considerable number of women. It's called premenstrual syndrome, and in some, the consequences have been tragic. Santos later pleaded guilty to a reduced charge. But more PMS cases are sure to arise, and an impassioned debate is only beginning.
We can't confuse the medical problems that women have in connection with the menstrual cycle and the issue of insanity and criminal behavior.
The defense, if it has a function at all, is to raise a reasonable doubt. And I would not have to prove what all of medical science has hitherto been unable to do. Rather, if anything, I would just have to show that there was a possibility, there was a doubt for which one could give a reason. Premenstrual stress syndrome may not as yet be a medical certainty, but it may be enough to raise a reasonable doubt.
If the PMS controversy does anything, I hope at least it will focus the American public's attention on the fact that we have not had adequate medical research into and adequate treatment for women who suffer very extreme pain, discomfort, and symptoms like that.